This video is all about the science of predicting happiness, how we as individuals try and honestly usually fail when it comes to predicting what will make us happier in our lives. Now, I hope that message doesn't sound too pessimistic, because I will share one scientifically validated approach that we can use that really helps us be better predictors. Before we get there, I want to begin with just this insight that really most of our lives are us trying to predict what is going to make our future selves happy. Think about it for a second. I mean, why do I do anything? Why am I making this video? Well, in some ways, and this is maybe not a perfect example because I do enjoy the process of recording these videos, but that being said, it's about 9:50 right now. At 9:30, I said, I think I will enjoy making this video. And then I think that if I make the video and people watch it and they learn something, then that'll improve my life too, and I'll be happier for that reason. What school do we go to? What career do we pick? Who do we marry? But also simple things. Why do I stop at the store after work and pick up a case of beer? All of these things, like pretty much the main thing navigating our path through life often is this process of trying to imagine or predict what will make future me happy. And much like raising kids or trying to maybe surprise someone with a gift or even having a romantic partner, often what we think about this other person, in this case future me, is not so accurate. Right? Our predictions aren't the best. And let's get into some of the psychology of this. And the main researcher I'm referencing here is Dan Gilbert, who is a psychologist at Harvard who specializes in affective forecasting. Now, affective forecasting, affective with an A, refers to emotions, feeling. Forecasting, of course, is predicting. So that's the very scientific or academic term for guessing about how we're going to feel or predicting how we're going to feel. So he studies that, and he basically explains that humans are fairly good at assessing or having an awareness of how we feel in the present. And we're not always so good at turning it into language, but I'm pretty good at saying, right now I feel fairly happy, or I feel pretty good, or I feel a little down, I feel tired, etc. When it comes to remembering or assessing how we felt in the past, we're not great. And when it comes to predicting how we're going to feel in the future, we're downright terrible. And there's one study that Dan Gilbert references, he was not the one who did the study, that I think explains this very well. And it's the Bush-Gore study. And what they did was they had groups of people, this was in the early 2000s with the Bush and Gore election, and they had Bush voters or George Bush supporters, and then they had Al Gore voters or Al Gore supporters. And for each group they asked, if your candidate wins, how happy do you think you'll be? And if your candidate loses, how happy do you think you'll be? And then when the election actually happened, the day after, they checked, how happy are you? How sad are you? And then several months later, they asked them again, looking back, how happy were you? How sad were you, right? So again, let's say I'm in this study, and let's say, hypothetically, I'm an Al Gore supporter. I'm gonna say, okay, Jackson, from 1 to 10, if Gore wins, how happy do you think you'll be? If he loses, how sad do you think you'll be? And then, whenever the election happens, let's say in a couple months from now, they're gonna ask me that day, Jackson, okay, Gore lost. How sad are you? And then, like several months later, say, Jackson, how sad were you after the election, okay? So here's basically the pattern they found amongst all these people, is the people who predict, and for those of you who aren't as familiar with political history, Al Gore did lose and George Bush won. So the people who were Bush supporters, they were less happy than they thought they would be when they asked them the day after the election. Gore supporters were less sad than they thought they would be. So basically, I thought, oh, I love George Bush, I'm gonna be 10 out of 10, it's gonna be the best day of my life. And Gore voters were like, oh, if Gore loses, it's gonna be the worst day of my life. Okay, that was their prediction of the future. In the present moment, what we found is that people were pretty good at determining where they were, and it was much less extreme than they thought. Dan Gilbert, I think, summarizes this with saying, you're going to be less happy than you think on your birthday and more happy than you think on Monday morning, right? But here's the really interesting part of the study, and why I say we're also not always the best at remembering how we felt in the past, is when you ask these people to remember back how they felt the day after the election, they did not remember or assess their happiness level based on what they said that day. They remembered their prediction. So if I said, remember back when hypothetical Jackson in this experiment, I would have been like 3 years old at the time, so it is hypothetical, I'm going to be a 1 out of 10 if Gore loses, because I love Al Gore. Okay, the day after, they asked me, what, Jackson, now that Gore lost, where are you from 1 to 10? Now I'm a 5. It wasn't a big deal. But then when they ask me a few months later, Jackson, how happy or sad were you after the election? I don't say, oh, I was about a 5. It was no big deal. I remember my prediction and I say, oh, I was a 1. It was the worst thing ever. So what you can see in that breakdown is that our predictions usually tend to be more extreme and they're just not very accurate. And then when we remember back, we tend to remember based on our expectation or our prediction and not actually how we felt in the moment. So the reason I share all that is because it's important to know that there are often these cognitive distortions when we think about longer term into the future and even remembering back past experiences. To the extent that we can do it, present in the moment assessments of our state are the most honest and accurate way of assessing our happiness and how we feel. And that's one reason why things like journaling can be a really, really effective tool, because you're in the moment taking notes on where you're at, and then later you can look back and say, well, how did I actually feel in that moment? That's much more reliable. Now, as I said at the beginning of this video, we were going to explain some of the science and context here, but that I also wanted to share one scientifically validated practice or tool that you can use to overcome this issue, and that is what Dan Gilbert calls surrogates. So in the book Stumbling on Happiness, he writes about this. Essentially, this is, if we're thinking about predicting or forecasting, how happy will I be if X, Y, Z thing happens? He says one of the most effective things we can do is find what's called a happiness surrogate, which is find someone who is currently experiencing that situation and ask them how it is. So if we think, oh, maybe I want to be an accountant, I want to be an auditor. Well, ask someone who, and maybe let's say you're 20 years old, ask someone who's in their early 20s working in audit and accounting at the company you want to work for, hey, what's your happiness level? If you think, oh, I really think I want to go live abroad in Spain for a year and just explore and see what I like. Well, maybe you can find someone in your network or even someone online who is a travel influencer or something, and maybe that's not a perfect example because that's a whole different lifestyle, but maybe you can find someone who is from your region who, is currently doing a year abroad studying in Spain, and say, well, how is it over there? What's it like? And Gilbert points out that we tend to think this won't work, right? Our biases again, because we overestimate how different other people are from ourselves. So we might say, oh, well, I'm dead set on becoming an accountant, and if I go talk to Charlie over there, who's a few years older than me, and he's at the same company, but his life's so different, it's not going to matter. That's not true. Granted, there are different circumstances and there are different internal factors that might affect how we respond to the same conditions. But by and large, the in-the-moment account of people who are having the experience is much, much more reliable than our assumptions about the experiment. Or about the experience, excuse me. So what we have covered in this video, if we look at cognitive science and the psychology behind effective forecasting, again, predicting how we're going to feel, we're pretty good at determining how happy we are right now. We're not always very good at remembering. We can sort of paint with broad brushstrokes and say I was happy or sad, but it's not very precise. And then when it comes to predicting the future, we're pretty bad. But one thing we can do to be better at it is finding a surrogate, finding someone who is currently in that situation or having that experience in the present moment, and trying to better understand how their happiness or how their quality of life has been affected by it. So I hope you found this video on some of the science of happiness to be helpful. If you want more videos, you can check out my YouTube channel or my social media for more of these short lessons on the science of happiness. That's Jackson Kirchis and studyhappiness.blog. That's all for now.